Ba 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 ba.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists podcast, episode 26. This is our 6-month anniversary show and it's a special on the greatness of classical music. I have with me Mark Richardson from Oz Conservative. How are you, Mark?
I'm very well, thank you, Mark, and thanks for having me on again.
You're welcome. And David Hiscox from XYZ. How are you, David?
Very good, Mark. Thanks for having me. It's interesting that this is our anniversary, 6 months, because it's also this year being 2020. It's the anniversary year, 250 years since Ludwig van Beethoven was born in 1770.
Oh.
Yeah.
And the 250th anniversary of Captain Cook's crew sighting the east coast of Australia.
Yeah, the discovery of Australia.
Yeah. Now, as I said, our topic today is the greatness of classical music. Who'd like to start? I think Mark Richardson would like to start.
I'm going to go back to a book I'm pushing a little bit at the moment. It's the Lawrence Oster book, Our Borders, Ourselves, which deals a lot with culture. And he actually mentions classical music. He says, from the ancient Greeks onward, there has been the sense that the Western individual realizes himself by moving beyond himself, following a truth that is higher than himself. The feeling of this upward moving spirit is conveyed in European classical music with its structured dance-like movement toward climax and release. So for Oster, that whole canon of Western classical music, it's like a monument to the Western soul, if you like, and the best of the Western soul, and that reaching toward some truth that is outside of ourselves. That's, to me, it's been a lifelong passion to listen to classical music because it does have that effect on me. It always, I think, raises my own character to listen to it. It reaches in a profound way. It talks in a profound way to me. So, you know, I see it as one of the great achievements of our civilization. I'll leave it at that for the moment and hand over to David.
Oh, it takes a lot of concentration to listen properly to classical music. I've been playing piano for about 33 years now, but like I will still tune in and out sometimes when I'm listening to classical music. It takes a lot of devotion to actually just focus.
Now tell us your musical background, David.
Oh, okay. I play piano. I started piano lessons when I was 7.5.
Yep.
And so I did VCE music, and then I studied music at Melbourne University. I had a few years away from it, and then I came back to it. I was doing a thesis, a politics thesis at Melbourne Uni again, and I procrastinated by playing classical music, and I procrastinated so much that I realised that that's what I wanted to do with my life. So I did that for a while, and then politics has a way of kind of dragging you back in, so that's why I'm doing this sort of thing now again.
Just when you thought you were out, they drag you back in.
Yeah, that's it. And I teach music as well. I teach piano, and I can play a couple of other instruments, but not particularly well. But I enjoy learning because like I know how to learn, and so I like sort of going back and doing guitar properly or doing singing properly because I find that quite satisfying. So as a pianist, like my first love is classical music. Like I've played a lot of Chopin and Beethoven, and then just expanded from there through a whole lot of different composers.
My entryway into classical music was, I remember this, on my 15th birthday.
Yeah.
My father gave me as a present it was a cassette, an audio cassette of Beethoven's sonatas.
Oh wow! Yeah,
and
good entry point.
Yeah, excellent choice from my father. And I still remember actually listening the first time and being more intrigued than anything, being hooked, but not yet really getting it. And I just kept playing and listening, and and it just opened up the whole world of that music to me. It's interesting that you have an interest in Beethoven.
I love Beethoven stuff. If we focus, one aside, kind of got inspired a similar way. I have an aunt who plays piano as well. I think it would have been Christmas in 1987. I got a cassette of Chopin, Vladimir Ashkenazy playing Chopin. And so the first piece, we could put this link in the description, was Chopin's Etude. I think it's from his Opus 25 series in A minor. And it starts off with this just one note going, bum, bum, ba, bum, 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 bum. And so I heard that and I thought, maybe Chopin just wrote simple music for kids. And that melody just becomes this, like, this uniting theme all the way through the piece, while one hand is always just going absolutely nuts. It's incredible. So with Beethoven, his sonatas, if you listen from start to finish, it's quite a thing. He wrote 32 of them, but if you just sort of take snippets of them, you get a look at Beethoven's life. So when he was young, he was just full of energy. He was a virtuoso. Pianists would come from all over Europe to have piano offs with him. They would have battles, and nobody could match it. He was the best. And then in his midlife, he started going deaf, and that caused a huge personal crisis for him. He nearly committed suicide, but he stuck at it. And the amazing thing about when you listen to the music from this period, he never wallowed. He was incredibly sick. And he was very depressed, but he just wrote some of the most inspiring music that he's ever written. And then in his later period, when he's getting older, he stopped writing everything in Italian for some reason. Like, it was the convention that you would write all the instructions on the music in Italian, but he started writing everything in German. And he started taking a lot more influence from Bach. His music became much more contrapuntal, and it's like he just sort of reached a whole nother level, and that kind of sums up Beethoven's life. If I'll read something by Beethoven before I pass it back to you. It's something that, like, if you're looking for something to sum up what you were talking about, how it's something that it's a legacy that we all have as Europeans. And this kind of this letter by Ludwig van Beethoven kind of sums it up. It was a letter that he wrote to his brothers towards the end of his life, when he knew he was dying, and he wanted to sort of explain why he was always such an old grump. And he explained to them that he loved them and he had a deep love for all humanity, but he was very embarrassed about the fact that he was deaf, especially considering his profession. And he wrote about the personal crisis that he went through. So he recounts a little. I'll start from here. But what a humiliation when one stood beside me and heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone heard the shepherd singing and I again heard nothing. Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair. But little more and I would have put an end to my life. Only art it was that withheld me. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon me to produce. So I endured this wretched existence. I think that's an amazing an amazing line. Like, when we listen to Beethoven's music, and you can get it on any CD, on YouTube, and it's Beethoven's music is just like it's the soundtrack to much of our existence. But when you see what the guy went through to create what he created, I just find that amazing. All I've got for Beethoven is thank you. It's all I want to do is just say thank you to Beethoven.
Yeah, I have that feeling often as well. I'm going to take over your hosting for a second and ask David a question.
Yeah, sure.
So there are obviously very different styles of classical music.
Yes.
And I find myself enjoying all of them and travelling between them, just depending on what my own inner state is, I guess. Sometimes I love Baroque sacred music, but other times the virtuosity of the Romantic movement. You said earlier, before we came on, that you had some ideas yourself about the shift from one movement to another, one period to another.
Absolutely.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, if you look at Western music going all the way back, like we've always had folk music, and I don't know if there are many records from the classical age, the actual classical age, but we've always had those instruments. We've got other instruments from like other races and all that sort of stuff as well. Where I guess our understanding of modern music sort of kicks off is in the Renaissance. And if you listen to music from the Renaissance period, it's like you're listening to Baroque music, but it's like they were still kind of figuring out what they wanted to do with harmony and all this sort of stuff. And then Baroque music came along. That's a terrible way of putting it. We sort of look back at history now and sort of classify when certain eras started and finished. And so Renaissance music is classified as finishing in about 1600. And then Baroque music went from 1600 to 1750. And in that era, the best way I can find of describing it is describing what kind of keyboards they had at that stage. So the keyboard instruments, they weren't like the pianos that we have now. They were much smaller. They had a much smaller range. So rather than having big ideas that can just flow all the way across the piano, they had it's like the melodies were shorter and just more compact. And so when Bach was writing his music, it's like he had it's like you hear a little idea and then you hear a counter idea to that, and then you hear another counter idea, and then all of these ideas are sort of interwoven together like pieces of different coloured wool, and they make a tapestry. And then what you'll find with what we describe as classical music, which went from 1700 to 1800, again these are very arbitrary dates, the music simplified. It was the era of the so-called Enlightenment, and so they focused on simplicity and elegance. And to me, the perfect example of that is the music of Mozart. Like it's some people will listen to it and wrongly think that it's simplistic, but there's a lot of detail, a lot of refinement, a lot of emotion just put into every little idea. Like if you look at the articulation which these composers instructed people to play, like you might have like a dozen notes in a phrase, but you've got to play each one like 3 or 4 different ways. And then the next period that we have is called the Romantic period. We define that as being from 1800 to 1900. So that period, that there's a clear break, like when we look at Western history in that period as well. Like it was the time of the French Revolution. At that period, the royal families of Europe were sort of literally being killed off. Composers up until that time had generally found a good living by being employed by the royal families. If you look at Joseph Haydn, for example, like his 20s he spent teaching and composing during the day and performing in the evening, and then at about the age of 30 he was employed by the Esterházys, and that kicked off his career.
Yeah, they would travel from court to court.
Absolutely.
When you read the biographies.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. But then in the 1800s that system died off, so composers had to find another way to earn a crust, but it also liberated them because they didn't have to write music for royal courts anymore. They wrote it more for the people. So they put more of themselves into the music. It was more romantic. You also found during that period nationalism started to creep into the music. A great example of that is the music of Frédéric Chopin. He was Polish, but he spent much of his life in France, and the Russians were in charge of Poland for a lot of that time as well. And so he wrote a lot of music for piano, and he wrote music that was typical of Poland. So he wrote polonaises and mazurkas. A mazurka is like a Polish version of a waltz, basically, and a polonaise is a very lively Polish dance. And you have other composers doing similar things. And then in the 1900s, we define that as modern music. And that's a very broad term. So you have impressionist music coming in during that period, and jazz coming in during that period, and then we have a lot of the modernist stuff coming in during that period, like in the last 100 years, which we'll talk about more in the next session. But that's a very broad overview.
Yeah. It's interesting you were saying one of my favourite pieces of music is Spem in Alium, a very famous piece by Thomas Tallis, who was an Englishman, and it was written in the very late 1500s.
Yes.
And the architecture of that music is so extraordinary. It's 7 different choirs, each in a sense doing their own thing, but it all working together. And I always think of this piece because I think we big note ourselves now that we're advanced and we're advanced civilization and we're all this, but I just don't think we produce art of that complexity and sophistication. And we're talking now the late 1500s. It always strikes me as an extraordinary thing that was produced at that time.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, when we look at what life was like, the depictions of what life was like back in those days, the struggles that they would have gone through, the pain that they would have felt every day because they didn't have toothpaste, you know, just to produce something of that magnitude is incredible.
Yeah.
Now, do you have a favourite composer?
All right, I'll start this one. I go through phases. I'm afraid I'm a serial monogamist when it comes to favourite composers. So for a long time I was a fan of Ralph Vaughan Williams, who again is an English composer of the sort of early 1900s. He wrote The Lark Ascending. He wrote a theme on Thomas Tallis, as it happens. That lasted for 5 years or something. I do love the piano music of Chopin, and I'll often listen to that in my car.
Do you have a favourite Chopin piece?
Oh, just some of the showy ones, the virtuosic ones, the Fantasy Impromptu, and I play a bit of piano too, but in a very amateurish way, and I always imagine myself being able to play something like that. There's some, as I mentioned before, some of the sacred Baroque music or late Renaissance music. There's Tallis, but there's a whole heap of them really. There's a Spanish composer called Victoria. So no, I am fairly open-minded rather than just having a favourite composer.
All right.
Good.
David?
Yeah, it's a similar thing. For me, like if I'm going to put a composer on the pedestal, Chopin and Beethoven have to join it. I've described the way I talk about Beethoven. There was a period where I said I didn't believe in God, but every time I listened to Beethoven's music, I couldn't but help it. And Chopin, just because like he was one of the first big composers that I really listened to when I was a kid, and so I've played a lot of his music, and so I love his sort of stuff. I've played a whole broad range of them. I love Beethoven's concertos, especially his 4th piano concerto and his 5th piano concerto. What I love about the piano concerto is that the piano concerto is where the piano plays with the orchestra, and when that idea started out, it's like the piano was maybe accompanying the orchestra, or they were even partners. But by the time Beethoven came along and wrote, say, his 5th piano concerto, which is, we refer to it as the Emperor, it's like it's a battle between the piano and the orchestra. It's like it starts off with both the piano and the orchestra play this big chord, and then the piano just goes bang, 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 like a cannon, and it's amazing stuff. I also I love the music of Rachmaninoff and Ravel. So Rachmaninoff, late Romantic, and Ravel is Impressionist. When I am feeling really, really tired, I'll play a lot of Baroque and classical music. Just the simplicity of the classical music, even though it's not simple. I love playing through Mozart's piano sonatas. I used to think that Mozart was baby music until I actually tried to play his stuff. And Bach, just going through his preludes and fugues and his inventions, it's just it's like it's therapy. It just soothes the soul. It's not easy stuff to play, but it's like you play it and you just start to absorb it.
Now, you were saying earlier that Bach actually was quite obscure at one point.
Yeah, because he spent most of his life working in a little cathedral, I think,
Yep.
in a small German town. I can't remember. But yeah, his work fell into obscurity. But then it's like the manuscripts sort of still existed, and it's like kind of like a secret code that all the composers sort of found along the way. So you can tell when a composer's started listening to Bach. You can see his influences in their music. And then in the 19th century, Felix Mendelssohn and a couple of others, they were in charge of orchestras, and so they made a point of programming Bach's music, and they popularized it again. So, because Bach lived from 1650 to sometime in the 1700s, I can't remember. But yeah, it was obscure for about a century.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Is there a modern composer that you like? Or if not contemporary, one, the most recent composer that you would say, yeah, I really like them?
Not at the same level, but there has been just in recent decades. There are pieces that I quite like. There's I think Ross Edwards wrote a symphony which is actually quite good. He wrote that in about 1990. I think Sculthorpe has written pieces. There's one called Country Town, which is very easy to listen to. Nigel Westlake, another Australian composer, has written some stuff that is good. They tend to be individual pieces, I have to say, though, rather than a large body of work.
In a similar vein, Carl Vine is an Australian composer. He uses a lot of jazz influences, and his piano concerto is beautiful, especially the second movement. We should put that link in there. And the other modern composer I can think of is actually John Williams. But when you listen to his music, especially from Star Wars, I think it's tremendous. What's interesting about his music is you can hear the composers that he references, especially Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky. I've got one more thing I was going to say about Mozart, but
No, keep going.
Well, I'll throw in something.
Yeah.
So, I think we're talking about the greatness of classical music, and I think we sometimes forget, but we should try and remember that. I mean, obviously there's music in other parts of the world, and there's good music in other parts of the world, but is there really anything that compares?
No,
and I don't think so. And it's something that if you are a Westerner and you identify with Western culture, you really should be proud of. And it should also make you think, why is it that we in the West produce this great body of art, which has not really been replicated anywhere else, and which, I mean, for instance, it's a very prestigious in parts of Asia to be able to perform Western classical music. It's considered an achievement, and there are good performers in those countries of Western classical music.
They have the IQ to appreciate it.
Yeah. And I really think people in an era in which we're always told how bad the West is, and we don't have a culture, and all of those things. There, it stands out that we actually did produce this canon of music, which is unparalleled. It hadn't existed anywhere before or anywhere else. It was us. And we should think through of what we have brought to the world, I think.
Absolutely. If you talk about what other people from other races and cultures, how they view Western music, you listen to the music from where they come from, and it's generally very rhythmic, and very dance orientated. And they listen to music, and like if they're trying to dance to it, they're like, I can't tell where beat one is, but I can tell because I've been trained to hear it. But and the music has always had a pulse, but it's our understanding of harmony and how we can create what we create has really developed beyond anything that they've created. It's like comparing the cathedrals of Europe to the huts in Africa. Like when you consider our Western music to African music, which is all just it's all about the dance, and they've got cross rhythms and all that sort of stuff. But and like in some places they actually have harmony, which is reflected. Like they understand the major keys and all that sort of stuff. But like it's not nowhere near the complexity of our own music, and just and the depth and the richness of our own music. Yeah, it's a real heritage.
Now you were going to say something about Mozart.
If we're sort of just about done, there's one more thing. I always used to sort of think of Mozart in the way that he lived his life. I thought he was like a bit of a libertine. Yeah. Because he wrote the music for Don Giovanni, and so like that's the story of basically a Casanova.
A rake or a
Yeah, but we've got to remember at the end of Don Giovanni gets dragged to hell.
Yep.
Yeah. And again, like if you think of the opera Così fan tutti, women are all the same. It's a comedy. It's a romantic comedy about friends who make a bet that their women will remain faithful to them, and so they come up with a ruse that they've been called off to the navy or the army, and then they dress up as foreigners and they woo their respective partners, or their friend's partner, and they succeed. But then at the end, they they apologize. They say, "Hey, it was all a ruse." Everybody apologizes to each other, and everybody lives happily ever after. So it's like a sort of a morality tale about the importance of being faithful to each other. And something that's never been sort of transmitted to me through popular culture and my education is just how much of a strong Christian Mozart was. There's a piece in here where he refers to Voltaire, actually. The ungodly arch-villain Voltaire has died miserably like a dog, just like a brute. This is his just reward.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hey, while we're on the topic of Mozart,
yes,
Salieri's music was not that bad.
Oh, really?
Maybe we can put a link in if you want to listen to his Requiem, and there seems to be some Mozartian influence to it, but in its own right, it is a brilliant piece of music. Yeah. So if you've ever seen that film, Amadeus, poor Salieri, I think, got...
He's the arch-villain of the...
He's the arch-villain, and his music is sort of seen to be third-rate or something. It's not. It's actually great music.
Well, every Hollywood movie needs a villain.
Yeah.
So the other line I was just going to read out was, this is what he wrote at the death of his mother. I am quite reconciled to the will of God, and hope that you and my sister will be the same. What other resource have we to make us calm? Knowing that it comes from God, who wills all things for our good. And no doctor, no man living, no misfortune, no casualty can either save or take away the life of any human being. None but God alone.
Wow.
Yeah. That was Mozart.
Okay, so thank you. You've taught me something. Because I had that received impression as well, that he's always portrayed as being the libertine, sort of like a nightclubber or something like that.
Yeah. I even suspected that Don Giovanni was him, that Casanova was him, but no, he was faithful to his wife. He loved his wife, and he loved God.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's been a interesting insight into the greatness of classical music, and I particularly liked your comment, Mark, about how this is our music. This is unique to us, and it's great in every sense of that word.
Yeah, that's right. It's a monument to our civilization and what we achieved.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Mark. Where can we find out more of your thinking?
At Oz Conservative, and there's also a link to my Twitter feed at the Oz Conservative webpage.
Very good. And David Hiscox, where can we find more of your thinking?
Come to the XYZ, xyz.net.au.
And I'm Mark Moncrief, and you can find more of my thoughts at Upon Hope. Just type that into your favourite search engine. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. Have a good week.